In this video, we learn about note durations.
Notes have many dimensions. We're going to look at just three. Pitch, or how high or low a note is. In physical terms, this would be the frequency. Duration, which indicates how long or how short a note is. In musical terms, this was where we refer to a note as being 4 beats long, such as a whole note, or 2 beats, a half note. And then thirdly, notes have dynamics, which refers to how loud or how soft a note is played. In physical terms, this would be the amplitude or volume. Duration in music describes the length of time a note is played in relationship to other notes. This is why we refer to note descriptors such as whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, and etc. Here you see the symbols for whole, half, quarter, eighth, and 16th notes. These kinds of notes, as listed on the left-hand side of the screen, describe a proportional relationship of note length or note duration in time. Let's take a look at these relationships. Let's first of all look at the relationship of whole notes to half notes. First, notice that each half note is half the value of a whole note. We haven't specified how long a whole note or a half note is. That really depends on the tempo of the music and what we consider to be the beat. We'll talk about beats in relationship to notes a little later. A whole note is conceived of as a unit. A half note in time is half that value. So you can see by the blue bars in our diagram here that it takes approximately, or it takes exactly, 2 half notes in duration to equal the length of a whole note. Quarter notes, as the name implies, are a quarter the value of a whole note in terms of time. Notice the bars, how it takes 4 bars to equal the length of a whole note. Looking at 8th and 16th notes, an eighth note is an eighth the value of a whole note. It would take 8 eighth notes to equal the length of a whole note. And subsequently, if you look below, look at the 16th notes, notice that it would take 16 16th notes to equal the length of a whole note.
Beat. The beat is the steady pulse of the music, much like your own heartbeat. It is often inaudible, but you can feel it. When you are tapping your foot or clapping your hands along with the music, you are demonstrating the beat of the music.
Now, how does this concept of beats work in terms of notes? Any one of our notes, whole, half, quarter, eighth, or 16th, can equal a beat. Then, and keep this in mind, the note value of the note above it is worth 2 beats. And the note value of the note below that note is worth half a beat. Let's take a little closer look at this with some specific examples. Let's start by looking at probably the most common example that you'll find in music. The quarter note equals 1 beat. This is probably most frequently the case. Remember, I said that if a quarter note equals a beat, then the kind of note above it is equal to 2 beats. So a half note would equal 2 beats, and a whole note would equal 4 beats. In turn, the notes below the quarter note are going to, the eighth note will be half of a beat. How about a 16th note? If an eighth note is half of a beat, what's a 16th note? The length of how many 16th notes would equal the length of a quarter note? The correct answer would be 4 16th notes, in which case each 16th note would be a quarter of a beat. So it would take 4 16th notes to equal a quarter note in length. Let's see if we can look at another example. What if the half note equals 1 beat? Sometimes this occurs, and it's called a la breve time, or cut time. If the half note equals a beat, remember what we said, the note above, or the note of greater value, the whole note is going to be twice the value. So that would make a whole note 2 beats. Again, let's return to the half note. Now what would the quarter note be, which is below the half note? If there are 2 quarter notes in a half note, that would make the quarter note a half a beat. In turn, the eighth note, 2 eighth notes and a quarter note, or 4 eighth notes and a half note, would make the eighth note a quarter beat. And finally, a 16th note, it would actually take 8 16th notes to equal a half note, so a 16th note would be equal to 1/8 of a beat. Rests. We mentioned this at the beginning. Silence is also an integral part of music, and it has its expression in terms of music notation. The silence we refer to and write as a rest. There are rests that equal the same value as we have notes for. So for example, we have the whole rest, the half rest, the quarter rest, the eighth rest, and the 16th rest. Let's talk about these individually. First of all, the whole rest. How do you recognize it? It can sometimes be confusing to tell apart the whole and half rest. I think of it this way. It's a little cheesy, but it sticks in my mind. The whole looks like a rectangle hanging below a line. Imagine somebody walking along that line. When they came to the hole, they'd fall into the hole, H-O-L-E. Sounds like the word W-H-O-L-E. Look at the half rest. It kind of looks like a hat. Hat, half. They start off with the same 2 letters. So if you think of whole, H-O-L-E, being the whole rest, and hat being the half rest, get this picture in your mind. It will occur to you and make it a lot easier to tell these 2 rests apart. The quarter rests. It's kind of a squiggly line. A lot of times it's written just as a Z when you're handwriting music. The eighth rest and the 16th rest, like the 8th and 16th notes, have flags. They're basically a line. An eighth note looks a lot like a number 7, the flag being the top of the 7. The 16th note has 2 of these flags. And if we were to continue on, there's a 32nd rest, which would have 3 flags, and a 64th rest, which would have 4. Now how about the lengths of these, or the duration? This is still a proportional system. So if a quarter rest is worth a beat, then a half rest is going to be worth 2 beats of silence, and a whole rest worth 4 beats of silence. An eighth note and 16th note will be shorter. Eighth note getting a half of a beat rest, and a 16th rest getting a quarter of a beat rest. Ties. Ties are used to extend the duration of a note. Often these occur over a bar line or across a bar line when you can't fit the entire note into a measure. Look at the 2 examples on the left. 2 quarter notes tied together. For example, if you can't fit another quarter note in the measure, you would put a quarter note in the next measure, connecting them with a tie so that note would be held out, in this case, for 2 beats if a quarter note equals 1 beat. The example below shows 2 half notes tied together. This would equal 4 beats if each individual half note is equal to 2 beats. You may notice that some notes have dots after them. A dot after a note adds half the value of the note duration. So for example, if you look at number 1, we have a dotted half note, which is going to be equal in length to a half a note plus half of that half note, which is a quarter note. If a quarter note is getting a beat, this means that a dotted half note is going to equal 2 plus 1, or 3 beats. Look at the second example. A dotted quarter note basically is equal in duration to a quarter note plus an eighth note, or a beat and a half if a quarter note is getting a beat. Usually dotted notes are followed up by the next smallest rhythm value, so you'll often see a dotted quarter note followed by an eighth note. Given that, look at the third example. A dotted eighth note is equal to an eighth note plus half of an eighth note, which is going to be what? If you said 16th note, you would be correct. A dotted eighth note is equal to the length of an eighth note plus a 16th note. Or if you want to think of it this way, it's equal to the length of 3 16th notes. Our last concept of duration is the breve. As you can see by the diagram on the screen, a breve looks like a whole note with two parallel lines on either side of it. It's actually equal to the equivalent of a double whole note. If you think of a whole note equaling 4 beats, that means a breve would equal 8 beats. You don't see this rhythm very often, but it does show up occasionally, especially in older Baroque and Renaissance music.